a long, long time ago. We will be talking with him later on in the program, and we will ask him about what motivated him to pen and record that song. It is Africa Day, and we'll be talking with an amazing young lady, she of Don't Touch My Studio fame. She is Lebohang Pheko, Senior Research Fellow and Political Economist at a think tank called Trade Collective. What we're going to unpack with her is Africa Day. What does it mean for you and I? How do we celebrate this day? What do we start thinking about to make Africa a better place for our future generations? Pheko, morning. Lebohang Pheko, good morning. Welcome. Welcome to the program. Can you hear me?
And thank you for calling me a young lady. That's been a long time.
Well, let me tell you something. I looked at that clip of that interview. I just, the interview with Andre Versace, and you look gorgeous. And what also kind of jumped out at me was, how bemused you were with the whole situation, and how you.
No, not bemused, just calm. You have to be in those. You have to be. I mean, I had a sense that something big was happening, and I wasn't going to be the one who was going to be looking ridiculous in that moment. But no, I'm not a demure person at all.
Well, I was so tickled watching it, and really, it was quite sad on his side. And what jumped, what kind of came to my mind, gender-based violence. And I thought to myself,
that's the thing. I think that's more important. I think that's the thing for me that was more important at the time, and even now, than the punchlines. And it wasn't funny. It wasn't funny then. It's still not funny at all, because it was actually a moment of misogynistic white supremacist violence and misogynist white supremacist toxicity playing itself out in the public domain. And I think that it's very unfortunate that even now, I think I saw something, it was trending on Twitter, that it's been 11 years since the studio moment, and even now that very few people are doing a really important political analysis, especially in the light of Black Lives Matter, especially in the light of the vocabulary that we are expanding all the time on how race and class intersect, and how colonialism and imperialist power intersect. And that's probably a good place to segue into the importance of Africa Liberation Day, particularly in the context of all of these challenges.
Absolutely. And also what I'm thinking, as you were, giving us context to that situation, that particular situation. Yes, I agree with you that it wasn't funny then, but what I found funny is what an idiot he made. He portrayed himself to be with his truly with his truly bad behavior. And the other thought that came to mind was, if that was a white lady sitting there in your chair, would he have behaved in the same way? Was it because you were Black that he felt superior, that he felt powerful, that he felt he could behave the way he did? Unacceptable behavior. What I found funny was what a clown he had made of himself, by behaving so badly. But obviously the whole situation was way more serious. That being said, Africa Day and what you have just contextualized a minute ago, how do we then tie it in with Africa Day, knowing that a lot of African states, a lot of African leaders, a lot of African people live in a very patriarchal society?
That's an interesting point. So I think the first is really to take it back to whether we're talking about Africa Day or whether we're talking about Africa Liberation Day. And in fact, when we understand Africa Liberation Day, it actually gives it the vocabulary is slightly different, the meaning, the intent, the context, and the power are slightly different. So Africa Day is kind of quite a flat space. It's a flat, random, slightly empty space devoid of political intent, in my opinion. But this is, in many cases, this day is actually called Africa Liberation Day, and it's named accordingly because it was actually a day of reckoning, and a day, of course, of great, a day of reckoning, and also, of course, a day of great great hope and aspiration. You know, it really commemorates the formation of the Organization of African Unity. It also then, which was of course an aspirational attempt to bring together and weave together the complex, multi-layered narrative of what it means to be African people, spearheaded, of course, by leaders such as Nkrumah, among others. Of course, he would have been the sort of the spiritual, intellectual lead, but he was not alone by any means. People like Sekou Toure was right alongside him, Julius Nyerere right alongside him, people like even Kenneth Kaunda, you know, and that, I think it's important celebrating that one of our founding patriarchs is still with us even today. So I think that certainly in terms of a liberatory imagination, the thing that's quite interesting about the Organization of African Union and the idea of African regionalism, which was ahead of the curve then, is that it is actually what gave a lot of inspiration to formations like the European Union, for example. They looked across at what was happening on the continent, and they realized themselves that as declining colonial powers, they couldn't begin. Their grasp of their bastion of power and of authority, political and territorial authority at least, was diminishing. And of course, it was an idea for them to then aggregate their diminishing fortunes together. So it's in fact this formation has actually given the world so many thoughts, so many hopes, and we have been trailblazers in this regard. Very unfortunate that we don't see ourselves that way. So in fact, really, what we're looking at today as African people is really, for me, the reason that it doesn't work out well is there are a couple of reasons, my sister. The one is that, of course, institutions become conservative and they become reactionary. So I think the Organization of African Unity is very different to what the African Union became, which was really a much more corporatized enterprise, right? And of course, remember that we had the lost years in the 1970s and 80s of structural adjustment, of coup d'etats, of cognitive violence, external violences, partly Western interests, which were also playing themselves out on African soil. We were also in the middle of the Cold War. So we were, fighting proxy. We were part of many proxy battles, geopolitical proxy battles between the so-called Soviet bloc and the United States. And these played themselves out, and of course was incredibly destabilizing on African soil. That, of course, was the intentional, basically disembowelment of our economies through structural adjustment, which basically reduced our states into client states, where really they were just at the behest of corporate interests or public-private partnerships, or internal indebtedness of the IMF and the World Bank. So those, they even lead one to us to rethink the definition of a state. So, the African continent and the many countries had a difficult time. And also remember that was at a time when many countries were the frontline states in particular, were taking a pounding in their resistance to the secular colonial apartheid regime.
Right.
So it was a very complicated time. It is only in the 1990s into the 2000s that we begin to see a resurgence, I think, in terms of at least African-driven democratic governance. And of course, these are very problematic terms because they come layered with the baggage of external interest, external imposition, in fact. But I think it's only now that we've been able, I think, in the last 15, 20 years, to begin to have the space to think ourselves through. I think the unfortunate thing is that in that thinking ourselves through, in my view, we don't really have the strong kind of really pillars of thought leadership, intellectual leadership, and ideological leadership. So that's the one layer that we, the African Union in itself is quite conservative. And many of our leaders are also extremely politically conservative and quite likely to be kowtowed, I think, by, neoliberal, market orthodox, post-Washington consensus. So we find ourselves in a very complicated time. But the thing that gives me a lot of hope is the notion of people to power liberation. So I think the ways in which African people themselves, number one, have a strong instinct of affinity amongst ourselves. So you go to anywhere in the world, I've been to places off of the continent where you see a person from Nigeria or a person from Kenya or a person from Guinea-Bissau, you get excited because there's that sense of affinity.
Mm-hmm.
European people do not have that. I've never in my life seen an Italian running across a conference hall to greet a German and say, "Oh, my fellow European." I mean, that's obviously, or even Asians. I've never seen a Filipino run across and say to a Japanese and say, "Oh, my fellow Asian." I mean, they just don't have that kind of affinity.
Right.
And that's what we have. And it's extremely special.
Okay, so what are we celebrating this year? What is the theme, and why should it be important? Also, what makes an African? Is it the color of your skin? What about minority communities that have settled in Africa, throughout Africa? They may be third, fourth generation, or even fifth generation settlers. How do we view them? Do they have the right to identify as Africans?
Well, that's a really delicious question. And I think that you sort of begin to point us in a direction when you use the word settler, because I think settled can mean different things. Settled can mean settled in the form of being a former conqueror, being one who has occupied wrongfully, and I think displaced the indigenous people, the owners of the land, the purveyors of the space. And remember that,
or migrants.
Yes, but I think there's a exactly, but that's a slightly different
a different
dimension. I think in terms of race, you touch on something important, which is of course, especially in the context of countries like South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia, where we're living with a cognitive presence of white settlers. To be frank,
absolutely.
It's extremely. I think that it's important for us to situate ourselves very carefully. I'm very blunt. For me, an African is a person who looks similar to me, and I say this because I think it's a question of the posture. And I think there are many people who walk around this land and inhabit it with a sense of arrogance. The entry was violent, the arrival was violent, the incursion was violent, and the ongoing encounters continue to be violent. They continue to be unapologetic. The encounters continue to be based on supremacism. They continue to be based on white entitlement and often masculinized entitlement. You mentioned Visachi, that there are many Visachis walking across this continent and across this region. And I think that, there's no way that I think that the land accepts them. I don't think that the land, it's interesting, I was watching a video a few weeks ago in a different context, which spoke about that the land is not an empty space. And this notion of perennialius is very complicated because, of course, it was premised, and that's where settlerism, settler colonialism is premised, right? It was premised on the idea that Black people were not actually people. Black and brown people were non-people. So therefore, when the settlers arrived, they didn't see people. They just saw these natives, these savages walking around. Therefore, and I think that dehumanization is exactly the reason why, even today, you will have a Visachi who feels entitled to behave in a particular way because he sees as non-human, and there are many like him. Absolutely. So for me, it's not very complicated. And then I think the political tradition that I belong to says that an African is anybody who owes their full allegiance and their loyalty to the continent. But very few show that. I mean, for me, I think anybody who calls themselves an African should at least be able to speak an African language. You know what I mean? I think that we can't perform Africanness. And when you say what is an African, you should at least have a sense of. You should be able to pronounce people's names. I think it's a disgrace and a travesty that there are people who are on this continent, who have been on this continent intergenerationally, let's just say 4, 5, 10 generations, 100, 400 and 150 years, who can't even pronounce a name like in Tabitsen, who can't pronounce Lebohang, who can't pronounce Siposami, so they would rather either mutilate it or rename a person. And that thing is very sensitive, as you know, because many of our mothers and fathers, our elders who are forced to work in kitchens or go to the mines, were renamed. And I think people like us, people of color, understand that names are sacred. So I think in naming ourselves, we are then able to name the land. We're then able to situate ourselves. And I think it's very difficult for people who historically don't have an affinity to the land, to the space, to the earth, to situate themselves appropriately. And I think that is why we see so much cognitive and social violence, because there's an ongoing battle for territory, spiritual territory, physical territory, geographic territory, and of course political and economic territory. So it's an interesting and complicated question.
Okay. Uh, the theme for this year's Africa Day, I understand, is the year of arts, culture, and heritage. Why is that important? And then my closing question to you would be, how do Western countries view us, and the reason for them viewing African people the way they do? Not very complimentary in a lot of cases, given that perhaps some, I can't make a blanket statement here, but some view us as Africans being lazy, being corrupt, being very patriarchal, etc., etc., etc. All the negative narratives, and how do we change that narrative? And why is, just when you look at African art, for example, it's not viewed, it's not valued as highly as Western art, for example. So your thoughts on all of that?
I don't have a view on why. I can't explain why other people view us in a particular way. They need to explain themselves. I think racism is real. And I think it's to do with the colonial gaze and the white gaze. And I think I already mentioned that it speaks the same logic that views black and brown people as non-people, that views this land as empty. So from where they're standing, they still view this as an empty, barren space full of savages who are inhabiting, who are spoiling the view of their holiday homes. It would appear. I can't explain why it's supremacism. I've never understood it. I think I actually think it's a demonic spirit. I just think it's a strange, it's a bizarre thing, and I can't explain it. And it's also something that I don't want to give too much energy. I think it's for us. What's more important than how to change it? They need to change themselves. White people need to deal with themselves, change themselves, and get over themselves, and seek the spiritual counseling that they need in order to divest themselves of this hateful, animalistic hatred and toxicity that they have, and this need to dominate, this instinct to dominate, to conquer, and to annihilate. In fact, I mean, that's what imperial colonialism and the white gaze is. It's about annihilation. It's actually an ongoing genocide. And if they can't annihilate us physically, economically, take us out of their land, of course, then try to annihilate our culture. We keep hearing about our artworks, our literature, our paintings, our beautiful things of value, which are hiding in European museums and so on and so forth. So I think that it's a very deep question which one can't do justice in this moment. But I think I can link that then to
we need an hour-long interview to uncover all of this.
Indeed. But thank you so much.
No, before I let you go, it's the anniversary of Brother Floyd's death today, exactly a year since he
Floyd.
Absolutely, since he was murdered. And that slogan, "We can't breathe" or "I can't breathe," has reverberated around the world. Your thoughts on Black Lives Matter?
My thoughts on that is actually that it's unfortunate that it's a travesty what happened to him. But I think the greater travesty, the aligning travesty is that we don't even mention the many deaths and the many infractions that have happened on this continent. Remember that this young man, Lungisani, who was killed in Hawaii,
yes.
Police brutality. We need to call out those names. We need to call out Nathaniel Julian. We need to call out Collins Koza, who was the first. In fact, he was killed almost the same week as George Floyd in his own yard, right here in the south of Johannesburg by police brutality. We need to mention the young man who was killed just a few months ago during the Wit Trees Must Fall, the latest Trees Must Fall insurrection.
Right.
A passerby. We must call out our own names, and I think that what we shouldn't do, what we should guard against, is the idea that Black American lives are more important than that our own lives. That African lives on this continent are somehow less important, and I think that there's a problem with that. And I think that in itself is extremely problematic and slightly imperial. That things that come, issues of abroad somehow take up much more oxygen. There are people who are dying in Nigeria, and I'm ashamed to say that I can't mention any of them by name right now, but there have been several cases there of the same police brutality. And I think because it's not a black and white issue, it's a state brutality issue, folks don't seem to be making the connections as easily as they should be. So I think that, my response to that is that every African life on and off the continent, in and out of the diaspora, is very important. And when we need to call out their names, and we need to deconstruct the power dynamics and the institutional violences and the structural violences that keep on killing us and depriving us of death.
All right. On a positive note, in a half a minute, what should we be celebrating today? Africa Day. What
Everything. We should celebrate ourselves.
Proudly.
We should celebrate that we are breathing, and that despite all of the doomsayers, this continent is the oldest. This is the cradle of humanity, and we should not take that lightly. We are the cradle of humanity. We are the oldest civilization. Without us, there is no other life. And I don't say that that's a bold claim, and it's a true claim. Without us, there are no other civilizational possibilities. There would be no existence without us. Let us celebrate that, and the fact that we are resilient and we're still here, and we are breathing. We are breathing.
Absolutely, we are breathing, says Lebohang Pheko, talking to us about why Africa Day should matter to us and why we should be celebrating it. Thank you indeed. Have a great day and a year ahead. It is exactly 8:39 a.m.